Okay, so everyone, welcome to the Best Practices for Hybrid Presentations, which is an Accessibility Committee webinar. If you all were not aware, AECT actually does have an Accessibility Committee, and Amy Lomolini is our amazing chair. And so on behalf of the committee, we welcome you all to this presentation. And my name is Rita Fennelly-Atkinson, and I am presenting with my friend and colleague. Will, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Will Monroe. I'm the Assistant Director for Instructional Technology at the LSU Law Center, and I'm also an adjunct instructor here at LSU and a relatively new member of the Accessibility Committee that I was very excited to be able to join last year. So it's good to be here with you today and to talk about this.
Awesome. Okay, and before we get started, I just want to make sure that we credit the original people who created this presentation. We had Rebecca Reese and Ismahan Arslan-Ari who created this presentation. So I want to acknowledge that we took their work and then updated it. So I definitely want to credit their contribution to this because we did not do it alone. So for today, we're going to just cover some accessibility tips for during the presentation, some proactive steps to prepare an accessible presentation, additional resources, and then we will have an optional question and answer. Okay.
Oh, thank you, Rita. And I'll go ahead and take this first section about during the presentation. We're going to jump right into what's happening when you're presenting and consider visual elements. And the first one may seem obvious, but you want to remain visible in the camera. You want to ensure that the webcam frames your face and do your best to make sure that your face and mouth are visible while you're speaking. You want to be mindful of your background if possible and use a less distracting one. As you'll see, both Rita and I have these lovely AECT provided backgrounds that, I mean, I'm not using a green screen, but I think it still works so that you don't see all of my books and other clutter behind me here. You can also use, in tools like Zoom at least, solid color backgrounds or the sort of blurred feature background there. And moving from backgrounds to displayed text, you want to be sure that you verbalize what is on the screen. This includes your presentation title, your headings, and other important text. And this would also mean verbalizing questions that you receive in the chat before you respond to them. Moving on to alternative text. Many of you will probably be aware of, what alternative text is, or you've heard about it. Well, alternative text provides an accurate but concise description of an image that's usually made available to a screen reader or web browser. It's going to provide essential details. And as a rule of thumb, you might want to consider the kind of information you would convey over a phone call about an image. This is important when you provide your slides to your participants, as we're going to do with you. Make sure that they're accessible. Google Slides and PowerPoint and Keynote all provide you with means to add alternative text to images. And if you're unsure about how to describe more complex images or graphics, you might consider some of the advice provided by organizations like webaim.org that has a page dedicated to image accessibility here that we've linked to on our slides. Similarly, one that I really like is from diagramcenter.org, and they have great advice for describing not only simple images, but graphs, bar graphs, and all many different types of very complex graphics. Now, we were talking about embedding that alt text and that kind of information in your slides. Let's think about, as a presenter, what you're going to be doing when you're speaking. In spoken presentations, all members of your audience should be able to perceive and understand that content. So you're going to need to verbally describe any important visual information. Any audience members that you have who are blind or low vision will benefit, but so will those who, for a variety of reasons, cannot keep their 100% of their attention on the presentation. You want to make sure that you highlight key components of an image in a natural and non-obtrusive way. And although this may feel awkward or unnatural at first, practice will help. And you may find that this benefits everyone, since it's going to give you a chance to demonstrate proper use of terminology during your presentation. And linked to on that bullet in the slide is a webpage from the University of Colorado at Boulder that has a helpful page discussing the topic. And they have some model examples that you may find interesting. You want to describe other visual information. We're using, a video conferencing tool like Zoom, the sort of hand raising or other responses that you might receive. Make sure you describe those during your presentation. And of course, if you do play a video during your presentation, you want to make sure that your video has accurate closed captions that are displayed, or that you have, accurate open captions that are already, embedded within the video itself. So moving on to the next slide, during the presentation, considerations for audio and speaking. During any presentation, you want to make sure that you speak clearly. This benefits everyone, but it's going to help with live captions. It's going to help with the post-presentation production of captions, and it's going to help those whose native language may not be English. Similarly, you should consider using simple language whenever possible. Another consideration that I want to make, or recommendation I want to make, is that you consider using a dedicated microphone or a headset. Now, webcam mics can be pretty good, and if you have a relatively soundproof room, that's wonderful. But having a dedicated microphone on top of your desk or a headset like I'm wearing now can really help you to isolate your voice when the sorts of interruptions that you just don't expect can show up in the background. That may make those less of a problem for you. And of course, you want to make sure that all the relevant sound, any sounds that you're playing during your presentation, are audible too. And at this point, I want to hand it over to Rita to talk about cognitive considerations during the presentation.
Awesome. And I just want to make sure to just remind everyone that you should verbally repeat questions from the chat or audience, especially if you are in a live setting where you might be fielding questions from an in-person audience. You might hear the question, but any participants who are attending virtually may not be able to hear questions or comments made. So make sure that you verbally repeat them before you answer them. And likewise in the chat, if you're dropping resources or referencing something in the chat, make sure to repeat it for all of your audience. So for example, I just dropped a link to our slide deck in case you want to access it. And then also I dropped a message that if you wanted to drop questions or comments in the chat, you are welcome to do so. And feel free to send them to Will or myself privately if you don't feel comfortable posting it in the chat. So during the presentation, we want to be mindful of cognitive, not issues, but considerations. And for many reasons, if people are attending Zoom meetings or virtual presentations all day, or even in a conference setting in person all day, you are getting a lot of information, and it is very easy to get overwhelmed with all of those sensory inputs. That's why we have the term now Zoom fatigue. And as we're all starting to transition back to in-person events, there's also now social fatigue that many of us are experiencing. So make sure that you give people time to process information, especially if you are doing an interactive activity or you're asking your audience to respond in some way. Give them time to process the question or the directions and then interact with you. Avoid acronyms or jargon. Even though we will be presenting at a conference with many of our peers, acronyms are not always well known, especially if you are in a niche field. So whenever possible, try and make sure that you spell out or say out loud what the entire acronym stands for. And then avoid using jargon, especially if it is hyper specific to your field. Remember that you might have audience members who may not be experts in your specific area. We also have many attendees who have an international audience, and they may not be familiar with specific terms. So this will help make the presentation accessible to as many different people as possible. Also ensure that your presentation is easy to follow. So for example, we included a brief agenda where we specified our flow of our webinar today. And then we are providing appropriate transitions to mark when we are switching to a different topic. This can also be done visually, but make sure that you also do it verbally. Also make sure that you provide context for links shared with participants. So if I switch back to one of our previous slides, you will see that our links say exactly what they reference. So alternative text or describe your visuals. And in the chat, when I put the link to the slide deck, because I have to put in the raw URL link, I made sure I said what the link was for. So that way all the participants have a cue of what that resource is in the chat. So this will help your participants know what resources are being shared with them. Okay, and now we're going to talk about tech checks before the presentation. Will?
Okay, so tech checks. Let's imagine that you are about to give your presentation and everything is going splendidly and you have everything lined up and you open up your video conferencing tool and a little window pops up and says, you've got some updates, you've got Zoom updates. This may be something that will slow you down. You'll have to apply those updates, maybe restart your machine. So please consider, if you're using your own device, that Zoom or any other tool that you use is up to date and test it out prior to your presentation. Wireless connectivity and bandwidth. If you've had any opportunity to work from home during the last, I don't know, year and a half or so, you're probably very familiar with the parts of your house that may have the best wireless connection and bandwidth available. If you are not at home, if you're not in that location or aren't familiar with it, you might want to consider testing that bandwidth before the presentation simply by browsing the web, but you can also use tools like Internet Speed Test and any of the other sort of bandwidth checkers that a search engine will provide for you. You know, poor bandwidth can cause video latency issues. This can make your video or your slides freeze. This could make your audio drop out. These sorts of technical issues can prevent your audience from understanding you. You've worked hard on your research and ideas. You've worked hard on your presentation proposal and the slides. Don't let things like this keep you from being understood by that audience. Test your setup if you can. Solo tests with Zoom and other similar tools is a good option, but an even better one might be to test it with a friend or family member or colleague. How does your webcam mic actually sound? You know, what does the lighting really look like on the far end there? That's a good thing to check during your setup. And as we're trying to model here, Zoom backgrounds are just backgrounds. If you plan to use a background, try to use one that's not distracting, such as the one that we're using. Solid colors, as I mentioned earlier, are an option, but you should really avoid using animated backgrounds if you can. On the next page, on the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about presentation accessibility reminders. Okay, so we're in the realm of talking about slides and similar sorts of resources. Thankfully, AECT has provided some pre-approved slide templates that you can access at the link in the slide. Slide layouts on these templates and others are an important feature to consider. PowerPoint and Google Slides both contain built-in slide layouts. When you use them with a new slide, they will automatically make sure that the reading order that you intend will work for everyone. When you add a text box to, say, a slide in PowerPoint, it may not reflect the reading order that you have in mind. So I just want you to keep that in mind. That's why those layouts are important. Color contrast schemes. Many times, the difference between a foreground and a background color will not really be as much of an issue when you use those templates or built-in themes. And I believe it's true that the accessibility checkers in both PowerPoint and Google Slides will check that for you. However, you may want to be aware that PowerPoint has a built-in sort of eyedropper. This is a tool that will help you to obtain color values. And then you can use that to test it in a tool like the WebAIM color contrast checker that is linked to on the third bullet there that says sufficient contrast color. Google Slides does not have a built-in sort of color sampling tool like that, but if you're using Google Slides, Chrome extensions or Firefox extensions can help you to obtain those values. Easy to use, easy to read font faces. WebAIM has a detailed article that's linked to in the slide there that explains some of the fascinating things about how our brain parses, chunks of characters into meaning very quickly. To facilitate that, you want to make sure you use simple, familiar, and easily parsed fonts. Character complexity and ambiguity should be avoided. There's lots of recommendations there, so I won't go into them, but something to keep in mind. And alternative text with all images and graphics, the accessibility checker tools in PowerPoint and Google Slides will let you know if you don't have alternative text. Now, something else to consider, image description. Earlier, I mentioned that alternative text was very concise. Image description, or long description, as I've sometimes seen it called, refers to something more detailed. And this is text that's going to be available as a caption or other clearly associated text in a slide. And this is going to benefit not just, this is going to benefit your participants, including those who may not understand the image, not necessarily those who may be low vision. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, if you have embedded videos in your slides, you want to make sure that you caption those. So Rita will talk about some other accessibility reminders now.
Awesome. Thank you, Will. And I want to emphasize, I know Will talked a little bit before about, your settings in your presentation. And as we saw here today, especially with a conference, you are not necessarily setting up your presentation format. And we do have a lot of questions in the chat about specifics about different types of presentation formats. Unfortunately, we do not know the specifics of how ACT is organizing, and I know that they're starting to release information about different types of formats. So we encourage you to reference the information that they're posting. Unfortunately, we don't have those answers, so I apologize. But it is important to know that you will not, some settings may not always be enabled. So it is important for you to ask ahead of time. For example, our live transcript option on this webinar was not enabled, so we can't enable live captions. So that is one of those things that kind of happens, but it's important to just be aware of different settings and try and become as familiar with them as possible. So moving on to some additional presentation reminders, make sure to double check external content for accessibility. So for example, if you are using a video or a resource from another place, double check to see if it is accessible to your participants. They are not always. Most of the time, those accessibility features are being enabled more often, but that is not always the case. So you want to make sure that you know how accessible an item is. Definitely avoid excess animation or flashing images. I know GIFs are really popular, but they can be very distracting, and it can take away from your presentation. Avoid complicated data or charts or graphs, because you want to make sure that whatever you are presenting is giving the audience the information that you need. So if you are presenting a visual, and specifically with graphs, if you're presenting data, make sure that you know what it is that you want the audience to get from that graph if you are using it. So Do you want them to know that there is a trend? Do you want them to know that there is a difference between a treatment group and a non-treatment group? Do you want them to know that there's a difference between the populations? And whatever information that is, try and make it as clear as possible, and then make sure that you also verbally say it and include that information in the text presented on your slide. Again, try and avoid animations or slide transitions. While we always want to make our content engaging, sometimes it serves to distract from the presentation itself. And then, as Will said earlier, you want to use any built-in accessibility checkers if available. And then if possible, provide digital copies to participants. So we have a question about why avoid slide transitions. So with slide transitions, there's a lot of different kinds. Some of them are really subtle, like a fading, which is not very disruptive visually. But if you have ones that have a lot of visual changes, it can just make it difficult for someone to process the content. And it can be a distractor for people. So that was a great question. And again, a lot of these are just recommendations. You know what you're presenting and the purpose that you might be doing something. So, you know, just do what you think is most appropriate for your type of content. Sometimes some slide transitions are definitely appropriate if you want to call attention that you are transitioning to something specific. Providing digital copies to participants is great. If you are going to do that, make sure that it is accessible. If you are not providing copies to participants, just let them know. There's many reasons why you may not want to. Maybe, you know, you're presenting content that you're awaiting to be published and you don't want to have that out quite just yet. And that's fine. Just let participants know that whether or not you're providing a content digitally, and if so, why or why not. And if you are providing anything, just make sure that it is accessible. Okay, so now we are going to the accessibility checkers that we have been referencing. So as Will said earlier, every type of presentation format has some type of accessibility considerations. So Microsoft PowerPoint has an accessibility checker that is built in and that you can use. And the links provided in this deck reference the specific support materials from each of these platforms. So if you are using PowerPoint, then you already have a built-in way to check the accessibility. Google Slides does not have a built-in accessibility checker. They provide recommendations on how to make your presentations accessible, but they do offer an add-on that you can add on to your tools and your slides. That's called Grackle Slides, which I personally use to check the accessibility of my presentations. Apple Keynote also does not have a built-in accessibility checker, but we provided the recommended practices that they offer in their support materials. Now, I will say that while an accessibility checker is great, they are limited. Any automated evaluation tool will not catch everything. So just be mindful of that it will catch a lot of, you know, really simple, most common errors, but it will not catch everything. So there might still be things that are inaccessible. But that's okay, because this is a learning experience and the goal is to be as accessible as possible and then learn and grow as we get feedback and find better ways of doing things. And the fact that you're here is already a great sign. And then I'm going to hand it back to Will, and he's going to talk about some resources.
And this is really just, thank you, Rita. And this is really just a brief mention here because we only have a few minutes left and we may want to take some more questions, but we have a few presentations here that you can refer to that were not created by AECT, but are very good. One in particular about the accessibility checker there at the bottom, and another one about general themes in creating accessible presentations. On the next slide, though, we have some presentations from our colleagues in the committee, in the Accessibility Committee, who created presentations last year on accessible documents and on captioning in YouTube. And something to keep in mind is that these technologies change quickly, and it's always good to keep abreast of the changes and go out and search for more. There's that's something you want to consider. So I guess we're kind of coming here to the end, and I do want to leave a little bit of room if we have other questions out there or anything else that we should consider discussing. I know that I am always learning about accessibility. It is my accessibility journey, I have not arrived. I'm always finding new things and some of these resources and learning from my colleagues. So if you have questions that you would rather ask later, our easy to, I think, memorize email address there, accessibility@aect.org, is available for you. And we'd love to hear from you. So.
Yes, and I am dropping the AECT committee email address in the chat as we speak. And also a hint, if you're going to be sharing a lot of different digital resources, it's helpful if you have a document with your leading text and URL so that you can just copy and paste them. So that way people can easily identify them. And I do want to call attention to Amy dropped some excellent information. The Accessibility Committee is also hosting another webinar specifically on creating accessible materials. That will be on Monday at 2:30 Eastern time. Information regarding that session will be shared in the upcoming news and notes and also in social media today. I will be sharing that. We highly recommend that you attend that session if that is of interest. Okay, and we have a great question, Will. It says, can you explain accessibility a bit more? Not sure what it means. That is a great question. So accessibility basically means that you want to provide as much access to everyone possible. That's a very broad definition. More specifically, it means that you want to make sure that people with different types of disability can access content or instruction or physical spaces, digital spaces in easily without any barriers. So that's the basic idea, is you want to reduce barriers as many as possible. It's not always possible to remove all of them. Accessibility is very complex, but it is possible to anticipate and minimize many of them. And so this presentation really just covers some very basics of removing the most common barriers. So I hope that answered your question. Will, do you want to add anything to that?
I think that's a wonderful answer. And I think the only thing I might add as an example of accessibility is I'm often thinking about, it seems like the one I'm always running into, alternative formats. I've got something that's available as an image. I've got something that's available as a narration or other audio. And what my challenge, if I'm trying to share this information, is to provide some alternative format that approximates the kind of meaning or function of that, image, video, audio narration, etc. So that's the only thing I might add to that definition.
Yes, and we're rounding up on to our time at 12:30. So we want to thank everyone who has joined us. I am dropping mine and Will's contact information in the chat as well, if you would like to reach out to us with specific questions. We will stay on here for a few minutes in case anyone has some questions. But if you need to move on to the rest of the day, we completely understand. So thank you so much for joining us. Will, any last parting words?
No, thank you for coming. Thank you for interacting with us and asking us questions. And we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar on Monday and at the conference itself.
Thank